My name is Wendy Thomas. I'm 29 years old, and I'm a registered nurse. Let her go. We won't pay for the surgery, my father told the doctor while I lay in a coma. Tubes down my throat and my heart barely beating. He said it as casually as someone canceling a subscription. His voice didn't tremble. He didn't hesitate. At 11:18 on a Tuesday night, he signed the Do Not Resuscitate order, not because the doctors had told him I was beyond saving, but because the billing department had given him a number. That was all it took, a number. When I woke up 3 weeks later, bruised, broken, and barely strong enough to lift my head, I discovered that the DNR wasn't even the worst thing he had done while I was unconscious. What I did during the next 24 hours didn't merely change my life. It destroyed his, and he never saw it coming because he had forgotten one thing about me. Before I continue, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely connect with this story. Now, let me take you back 7 months earlier, to the day my grandmother died, and everything began to unravel. I was born with a hole in my heart, a ventricular septal defect, as the cardiologist called it. I was 4 years old when they opened my chest. The operation lasted 11 hours. The bill took my parents 20 years to forget. Or rather, it took my mother 20 years to forget. My father never did. Do you know how much you cost this family, Wendy? I was 8 the first time he said it. I had asked for a new pair of sneakers. Mine had a crack running along the sole, and my socks became soaked whenever it rained. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of medical bills in front of him. He didn't even look up. $214,000. That's what you cost. I never got the sneakers. By the time I was 12, I had stopped asking for anything. At 15, I was babysitting for 3 different families on our block, so I could buy my own school supplies. At 18, I signed my first student loan by myself, while my older sister, Meredith, packed for the state university my parents were paying for in full. No one ever questioned the difference. Meredith received a car when she turned 16. I took the bus. My parents paid Meredith's tuition. I received a repayment plan. Meredith had birthday dinners in restaurants. I got a boxed cake and a card signed only by my mother, and I accepted every bit of it. That is the part that is hardest to explain. I wasn't angry. I truly believed I owed them. My father had repeated the same words so many times. You cost this family everything, that the debt felt as real as the scar across my chest. I carried it every day, as naturally and unconsciously as I carried my nurse's badge. The only person who never mentioned that debt was my grandmother, Lillian. Lillian Price lived alone in a small brick house on Elm Street in Norristown, Pennsylvania. It had 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and a porch swing that creaked whenever the wind blew. She had lived there for 41 years. She had raised my mother in that house, buried my grandfather from it, and kept its garden alive through every winter since. I began visiting her every Saturday when I was 23, newly graduated from nursing school and overwhelmed by student debt. I drove 40 minutes each way, brought her groceries, checked her blood pressure, sat beside her on the porch swing, and listened while she talked about nothing and everything. She never once told me, "You owe me." Instead, she would say things like, "Tell me about your week, sweetheart," and "Did you eat today?" Near the end, with her hands trembling and her voice barely louder than a whisper, she told me something I didn't understand. "I've taken care of things for you, Wendy. When the time comes, a man named Kessler will find you." I smiled and squeezed her hand. I thought she was confused. She became like that sometimes, or at least that was what I believed. She was 84, and I assumed her medication was making her talk that way. My father hated that I visited her. "You're wasting gas," he would say. "She doesn't even remember your name." That was a lie. Lillian remained sharp until her final breath. She remembered everything, including the things my father desperately wanted her to forget. She died on a Thursday in March, quietly in her sleep, inside that brick house on Elm Street. My father arranged the funeral. It was small and rushed. He wouldn't allow me to deliver a eulogy. "Keep it short," he told me at the funeral home entrance. "We're not making a spectacle." I stood in the back row and said goodbye without speaking. Lillian had told me that Kessler would find me. I didn't yet know who Kessler was. It would take a coma, a signed order for my death, and 4 days in a hospital bed before that name meant anything at all. 3 months after Lillian's funeral, I was driving home following a 12-hour overnight shift at the hospital. It was 4:17 in the morning. I was on Route 202, and a light rain was falling. I remember the time on the dashboard because I was calculating how many hours I could sleep before my next shift. 6 hours if I skipped breakfast, 5 if I took a shower. I never completed that calculation. A pickup truck ran the red light at 50 miles per hour. It struck the driver's side of my car with enough force to fold the frame inward like a sheet of paper. I don't remember the impact. I don't remember the glass. I was told that I remained conscious for approximately 90 seconds after the collision, long enough for the paramedic to hear me say my name. Then there was nothing. I had traumatic swelling in my brain, 4 broken ribs, and severe internal bleeding. The emergency team at St. Catherine's, my own hospital, the place where I had clocked in and out 5 days a week for 6 years, opened me up within the hour, but the bleeding wouldn't stop. I needed a second operation, a specialist, more time in the OR, and someone had to authorize it. I had no husband and no children. The emergency contact listed in my hospital file was the same person who had been there since I was 18, because my father had insisted on it. Gerald Thomas, next of kin. The hospital called him at 10:30 that night. He arrived at 10:47. I know the exact time because the front desk recorded it. He didn't go to my room first. He didn't ask a nurse about my condition. He didn't ask whether I was in pain, whether I was frightened, or whether I had regained consciousness even once. He went directly to the billing department and asked a single question. How much is this going to cost? I learned what happened next. From a woman named Patricia Walsh. Everyone at St. Catherine's called her Pat. She was our head nurse, had worked on the floor for 28 years, possessed a voice like gravel, and had a memory that overlooked nothing. Pat was standing at the nurse's station when my father came out of billing and approached Dr. Richard Hale, the surgeon responsible for my case. She heard every word. The second surgery, my father said. What's the estimate? Dr. Hale told him. It would cost between $180,000 and $240,000, depending on complications. Insurance would pay part of it, but the out-of-pocket amount would still be significant, especially because my father was a cosigner on several of my old medical accounts. He had insisted on becoming a cosigner when I was 18. I had believed it was an act of kindness. It was actually a leash. My father didn't blink. She doesn't have a healthcare proxy, he said. I'm her father. I'm the decision-maker here. Dr. Hale nodded cautiously. That was the protocol. If no proxy existed, the next of kin assumed responsibility. Then my father said it. Let her go. We won't pay for the surgery. Pat later told me that Dr. Hale didn't answer immediately. He simply stared at my father for a long moment. My father held his gaze. She's been a financial drain her whole life, he said. Don't resuscitate. He signed the DNR form. His hand remained steady. There was no hesitation. He placed the pen on the counter, asked whether there was anything else he needed to sign, and headed toward the elevator. He never entered my room. He never looked through the glass. He never said goodbye. Pat stood behind the station counter, clutching its edge with both hands. She told me afterward that her knuckles had turned white. She wanted to scream. She didn't. She did something better. She sat at the computer and opened my employee file. Every nurse at St. Catherine's completes an emergency packet during onboarding. It includes contact details, insurance information, allergies, and a section for designating a healthcare proxy. Most employees leave that final section blank. I hadn't. 3 years before that night, I had appointed Deborah Owens as my healthcare proxy. Deborah was my best friend from nursing school. She lived 45 minutes away in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. Her name, telephone number, and relationship to me were all clearly listed in my employee file. Pat found the information in less than 2 minutes. At 11:14 p.m., she called Deborah. Deborah answered after the second ring. Pat told her everything: the accident, the coma, the operation that needed authorization, and the father who had just signed an order allowing his daughter to die. Deborah didn't ask any questions. "I'm leaving now," she said. She drove for 90 minutes through the rain. At 12:51 a.m., she entered St. Catherine's carrying her driver's license and a copy of the proxy form she had kept inside her filing cabinet. Her hands were still shaking. She revoked the DNR. Then she authorized the surgery. Dr. Hale scrubbed in within the hour. My father was already home by then, asleep. He had no idea that the DNR had been overturned. As far as he knew, the machines would soon be stopped, and the hospital would telephone him in the morning with the news. Pat didn't call him. Deborah didn't call him. No one called him. Before finishing her shift, Pat did one more thing. She opened an internal incident report, the type staff members file after witnessing a potential protocol violation. She documented every word my father had said. She included the timestamps, his signature on the DNR, and the fact that he had falsely claimed, "I didn't have a healthcare proxy." Then she submitted the report, locked her computer, and sat alone in the break room for 20 minutes. Gerald Thomas went home that night, believing his daughter would be dead by morning. He slept soundly. The next day he made his second mistake. It was the mistake that would eventually cost him everything he owned. My father woke the following morning expecting the hospital to call. Perhaps he expected to hear a time of death or receive a request to sign another form. I can imagine that he had already rehearsed what he would tell everyone, the break in his voice. The hand pressed over his heart. "We lost her. Her injuries were simply too severe. But the hospital never called. No one contacted him to say that I was alive. The call just didn't come." Instead of calling the hospital himself, or driving there to check on his youngest daughter, Gerald Thomas spent that Wednesday morning doing something entirely different. He went to steal my house. Here is what I didn't know then, and wouldn't discover until weeks later. Before my grandmother Lillian died, she had already transferred the Norristown house into my name. Her personal attorney had handled the deed. The transfer was clean, legal, and properly filed with the county. My father had no idea it existed. What he did know was that Lillian was dead, her house was empty, and somebody was eventually going to claim it. He decided to make certain that person was him. He possessed a power of attorney document bearing my signature. Except I had never signed it. He had traced my handwriting from old medical consent forms. The documents he had pressured me to sign when I was barely 18 and didn't understand any better. He took the forged power of attorney to a notary he knew, a man named Carl who owed him a favor and didn't ask questions. Carl stamped the document. That same afternoon, Gerald filed a deed transfer at the county recorder's office. By Thursday, the house was registered in his name. By Friday, he had entered a bank and taken out a mortgage against it. $280,000, cash in hand within a week. None of the money went toward my medical treatment. He didn't deposit it into savings. He used it to repay gambling debts. Debts that no one in our family, our church, or our neighborhood knew existed. He didn't know the house had already been transferred to me. He didn't know how that transfer had happened, and he certainly didn't know anything about the man my grandmother had identified as Kessler's. But forged signatures have one weakness. They survive only for as long as no one examines them carefully. Someone was about to examine this one very closely. I opened my eyes on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the accident. The light around me was blue-white, the kind of light found only inside hospitals. It was too bright, too flat, and completely without warmth. I recognized it. I had worked beneath that light for 6 years, but I had never experienced it from this side before. My throat felt raw. The breathing tube had already been removed, yet I could still feel where it had rested, like a bruise deep inside my chest. My ribs hurt whenever I inhaled. My left arm was wrapped in a soft cast. Everything felt impossibly heavy. Even blinking required effort. The first face I saw belonged to Pat. Not my father, not my sister. Pat. She stood beside the window, her arms crossed as she watched my monitors. When she noticed that my eyes were open, She didn't gasp or rush toward me. She dragged a chair to the side of my bed and sat down. Then she took my hand. Her grip was firm and warm. "You're safe," she said. "There are some things I need to tell you. Not now. When you're ready." I tried to speak, but my voice emerged as a broken whisper. "How long?" "3 weeks. The surgery went well. You're going to be fine." I closed my eyes again, not because I was tired. I was trying to remember how I had gotten there. The pickup truck. The red light. The sound of the door opening. My father entered my room at 2:17 that afternoon. The nurses recorded the time. I know because I checked afterward. For a moment, he remained in the doorway. I studied his face. Something flickered across it for half a second, before his expression rearranged itself into something gentler and more practiced. I had read thousands of faces while working in the ICU. The fear of losing someone looks very different from the fear of being caught. My father rushed to my bedside and took my hand. Tears began running down his cheeks. "Oh, sweetheart, we were so scared. Thank God. Thank God you're all right." I looked at him, at his tears and his trembling lower lip. "Hi, Dad," I whispered. Meredith sent flowers that evening, a generic arrangement ordered from an online florist. She didn't visit. 2 days later, I was able to sit upright without assistance. Pat waited until the afternoon shift change, when the corridor was quiet and my door could remain closed without anyone questioning it. She pulled the same chair beside my bed. Immediately, for a moment, she stood there looking at me, as though she were deciding how to begin. "Just say it, Pat." She sat down. "The night of your accident, your father came to the hospital." "I know. He told me he was here every day." "He wasn't. He came once, on that first night. He spoke to Dr. Hale and asked how much your surgery would cost." I didn't interrupt. My hand remained still, on top of the blanket. "He told Dr. Hale you didn't have a healthcare proxy. He claimed he was the only person authorized to make decisions for you. Then, he signed a Do Not Resuscitate order." The room became completely silent. My monitor continued beeping. I counted 3 beeps before speaking. "He signed a DNR?" "Yes." "For me?" "Yes." "What were his exact words?" Pat looked directly at me. "Let her go. We won't pay for the surgery. She's been a financial drain her whole life." I closed my eyes, not because I was shocked. I closed them because I finally possessed the words for something I had felt throughout my entire life. The clear shape of a truth I had always understood, but had never heard expressed aloud. I was a line item, an expense, a number attached to a bill that never stopped growing. I opened my eyes. "How am I alive?" "I found the healthcare proxy in your employee file. Deborah Owens." I called her. "She drove here in the middle of the night and authorized the operation." "Is what he did officially recorded?" I filed an incident report. His exact words and the timestamps are documented. I stared at the ceiling for a long time. Then I looked at Pat. "Get me my phone." She opened the drawer in my bedside table and handed it to me. I switched it on. There were 32 missed calls from my father, and 11 from Meredith. I scrolled past every one of them. Then I opened my contacts and searched for a name I hadn't called in months. The name my grandmother had given me, Kesler. The phone rang twice. "This is Donald Kessler." His voice was calm and deliberate, the voice of a man who had examined 10,000 documents and had stopped being surprised by any of them. "Mr. Kessler, my name is Wendy Thomas. I believe my grandmother—" "Miss Thomas," he interrupted gently. "I've been trying to reach you for 4 months." My grip tightened around the phone. My ribs protested, but I didn't care. He explained that Lillian Price had entered his office 2 years before her death. She had sat opposite his desk, clear-minded and sharp-eyed, and told him she wanted to prepare a will. She didn't want the family attorney involved. She didn't want anyone her son-in-law might know involved. She wanted the will handled privately through Kessler, notarized by his own staff, and sealed. Its terms were simple. The house on Elm Street in Norristown would go solely to Wendy Marie Thomas. A trust account containing $85,000 would also go solely to Wendy Marie Thomas. There were no other names and no conditions. "It was probated 5 months ago," Kessler told me. "The court confirmed it. The deed transferring the house into your name was filed and recorded. I mailed certified letters to your address, but they were returned. I called the telephone number listed for you, and someone told me you had moved out of state and didn't want to be contacted. My father. It had been my father's voice on the telephone, telling Kessler I was gone. I'm in the hospital, Mr. Kessler. I was involved in a car accident. I've been in a coma for 3 weeks. There was a pause. I'm sorry to hear that, Miss Thomas. The house, I said. Is it still registered in my name? The pause that followed was longer. Let me retrieve the current deed records. I'll call you back within an hour. I ended the call and rested the phone against my chest. Pat was still in the room, standing near the door. Your grandmother told me you would call. Kessler had said before we disconnected. She said, Wendy always comes through. Just give her time. 1 hour. That was all Donald Kessler needed to discover what my father had done. It was also all the time needed for my plan to begin. The telephone rang 53 minutes later. Kessler's voice had changed. It was still controlled, but an edge now rested beneath it. The restrained tension of a man who had just uncovered something unexpected. Miss Thomas, the deed to your grandmother's property was transferred out of your name 3 weeks ago. I stared at the IV drip connected to my arm and counted the falling drops. 1, 2, 3. Transferred to whom? Gerald Thomas. Your father. The transfer was completed using a power of attorney. I never signed a power of attorney, Mr. Kessler. I know you didn't. I have the original deed transfer from probate, bearing your signature and notarized by my office. You never authorized a power of attorney or recorded one through my firm. So it's forged. That is my assessment, yes, and there's more. I conducted a lien search on the property. A mortgage was recorded against it 6 days ago for $280,000. That number occupied the room like a third person. I could hear Kessler breathing on the other end, waiting for my response. He leveraged the house. He did. I reached for the pen on my bedside table. My hand wasn't shaking. I don't know why. Perhaps nothing about this truly surprised me. Perhaps I had spent 29 years learning exactly who my father was, and this was merely the final lesson. I wrote down each number Kessler provided, the mortgage amount, the recording date, the lien holder, and the identification number on the notary's stamp. Miss Thomas, do you want to press charges? Not yet. First, I want to know how deep this goes. There's one more thing, Kessler said. Your grandmother left a sealed letter for you. She instructed me to deliver it personally, and only to you. I put down the pen. When can you come to the hospital? Tomorrow morning at 9. I'll be here. I ended the call and wrote down the final number. Then I turned toward Pat, who had remained silently beside the window throughout the conversation. Pat, what time did my father sign the DNR? 11:18 p.m. I wrote that down as well. Gerald Thomas visited his daughter the following afternoon, carrying a bouquet of yellow roses and a plastic container filled with banana bread Meredith had baked. He placed both items on the table beside my bed, kissed my forehead, and lowered himself into a chair with the exhausted sigh of a man burdened by enormous responsibility. He was very good at performing that role. I had watched him do it throughout my life. At parent-teacher conferences, church potlucks, and holiday dinners, the tired father, the quiet provider, the man who had sacrificed everything and never complained. The doctors say you'll be discharged in a week, he said as he squeezed my hand. We'll take care of everything. Thank you, Dad. Meredith had come with him this time. It was her first visit since the accident. She stood at the end of my bed, holding her phone and wearing a tight smile that never reached her eyes. We were so worried, she said. I couldn't sleep for weeks. I looked at her. She turned toward the window. My father leaned closer, speaking in the low, warm voice he used whenever he wanted someone to feel protected. Don't worry about the medical bills, sweetheart. We'll work it out as a family. That's what families do. That was what families did. The man who had signed an order for my death was sitting beside my hospital bed, holding my hand and lecturing me about family. As a family, I repeated. I squeezed his hand, then I smiled. He smiled back, satisfied. He believed the performance was working. They stayed for 40 minutes. Gerald talked about the weather, the Phillies, and a leaking pipe he had repaired for a client on Saturday. Meredith looked at her phone 11 times. Then they left. I watched the door close behind them. For 10 seconds, I remained completely still. The room was silent. Then I picked up my phone and called Kessler. Mr. Kessler, when can you come? Bring the letter. Donald Kessler arrived at 9 the next morning. He was shorter than I had imagined. He wore a gray suit and silver-rimmed glasses and carried a leather briefcase that looked as though it had survived decades of use. He shook my hand carefully, avoiding the IV line, and pulled a chair beside the bed. Your grandmother spoke about you frequently, he said. She mentioned you during every meeting. He opened the briefcase. Inside was a sealed manila envelope. My name was written across the front, in Lillian's handwriting. Just one word, Wendy. I broke the seal with care. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded twice. Her handwriting was thin but steady. She had written the letter while she could still hold a pen. Wendy, I know your father will try to take everything. He already has over the years. My pension, my savings, and other things I never told you about, because I didn't want to break the family apart. That was my mistake. Don't make it yours. The house belongs to you. The money belongs to you. Mr. Kessler has all the documents. Don't allow anyone to take what is yours. Not even your father, especially your father. You are stronger than I was, sweetheart. You always have been. I'm sorry I didn't tell you this, while I could still hold your hand. For the first time since waking up, I cried. I hadn't cried after the accident, after hearing Pat's words, or after each cold discovery had been stacked upon the last like another brick. I didn't cry because I was weak. I cried because my grandmother had seen me, all of me. She had prepared for this moment the same way she had prepared for everything else. Quietly, carefully, and with a kind of love that never demanded recognition. Kessler waited. When I was ready, he placed a thick folder on the blanket beside me. It contained the original will, the probate records, the deed transferring the property into my name, and the lien search showing the mortgage my father had taken against the house. You have everything you need, he said. What do you want to do? I wiped my face and pushed myself into a more upright position. Pain tore through my ribs. I didn't care. I want to handle this properly. I want to do it publicly, and I want everything ready before Sunday. Kessler raised one eyebrow. What happens Sunday? Our church holds its monthly community gathering. My father is a deacon. He never misses it. All right. I need to pause here for a moment. If you're watching this and thinking, I know exactly how this feels, or if you're wondering, what is she going to do on Sunday? Leave a comment right now. Tell me what you think. Should she confront him publicly, or deal with it privately? I genuinely want to know what you would do. Now, back to the story. 5 days after I regained consciousness, the hospital discharged me. I was still bruised, sore, and moving slowly. Some of the bruises were in places I couldn't even see. But I could walk, I could think, and I could make my own decisions. That was all that mattered. My father arrived at 10 that morning to collect me. He had brought a suitcase. You're staying with us until you recover, he announced. He didn't ask me. He stated it as he stated everything else. No arguments. That's kind of you, Dad, but Deborah is picking me up. She has a spare room. His expression shifted, not dramatically. Gerald Thomas never allowed the mask to slip very far, but the corners of his mouth tightened. You'd rather live with a stranger than stay with your own family. She isn't a stranger. She has been my emergency contact for 3 years. Something moved behind his eyes, a calculation, but it didn't resolve into an answer. He still didn't connect Deborah to the healthcare proxy. Not yet. Fine, he said. He lifted the suitcase he had brought and walked out without saying goodbye. That evening, Meredith sent me a text. Dad's upset. You're being ungrateful after everything he's been through. I read the message and placed my phone on the table. I didn't reply. At Deborah's apartment, I sat at her kitchen table and called Kessler. Together, we reviewed the timeline. He confirmed every filing, a court motion to invalidate the fraudulent deed, a police report for forgery, a formal notification to the mortgage lender informing them that the property title was disputed. Everything was prepared. Everything was in order. Sunday. I said Sunday. He agreed. That night my father called. I almost ignored it, but I needed to hear what he had to say. By the way, he began, his tone casual and nearly rehearsed. Grandma Lillian's house. I've been dealing with the estate matters. Don't worry about any of it. I'll explain everything once you're feeling better. He was testing me, checking the boundaries, trying to determine what I knew. Okay, Dad, I said. Thank you for taking care of it. I ended the call and placed my phone face down on the table. Deborah stood in the kitchen doorway, watching me. How do you do that? She asked. How do you stay so calm? Practice, I answered. 29 years of practice. Let me tell you about my father's church. First Grace Community Church stood on a tree-lined road in a suburbs west of Philadelphia. It had a white steeple, red brick walls, and a parking lot that was completely full by 9:45 every Sunday morning. Approximately 120 people attended each week. Families, retired couples, teachers, small business owners. It was the kind of congregation where everyone knew your name, your children's names, and which dish you had brought to the previous potluck. Gerald Thomas had served as a deacon there for 15 years. He greeted people at the entrance. He read scripture from the lectern. He organized the men's breakfast. After every service, he shook hands with everyone in the room, looked each person directly in the eye, and asked about their children. When the church needed a new roof, Gerald led the fundraising campaign. When someone's furnace failed in January, Gerald repaired it without charging $1. Pastor David mentioned him during sermons. A man of faith and sacrifice. That was the phrase. I had heard it so many times that I could feel the words in my teeth. On the first Sunday of every month, the church hosted a community potluck in the fellowship hall. There were folding tables, casserole dishes, paper plates, and a standing microphone near the front, where members shared blessings and prayer requests. Gerald always spoke. He always talked about gratitude, about family, about what it meant to give without expecting anything in return. 120 people believed every word he said, and the approaching Sunday was the first Sunday of the month. I called Kessler on Saturday evening. Can you be there at noon? I'll be there at 11:30. I ended the call and sat on Deborah's couch. My ribs still ached whenever I breathed too deeply. The bruises covering my forearms had faded from purple to yellow. I could walk without wincing now, slowly, but upright. I wasn't preparing to make a scene. I was preparing to have a conversation. But when 120 people are present, every conversation becomes a stage. At 7 o'clock Sunday morning, I woke before my alarm. I stood in front of the mirror in Deborah's bathroom and studied myself. The bruise along my jaw was almost gone. The one beneath my left eye had faded to a pale green. My collarbone still hurt whenever I lifted my arm too high. I looked like someone who had been struck by a truck. Because I had been. I dressed in a white button-down shirt and black slacks. Simple and clean. I wore no jewelry except the small silver studs Lillian had given me for my 21st birthday. I pulled back my hair, washed my face, and didn't bother applying makeup. Then I picked up the manila folder from the kitchen table. Inside were copies of Lillian's will, the original deed naming me as the owner, the county lien records showing the mortgage my father had taken out, and the redacted incident report Pat had provided. The one containing my father's words in black ink on official hospital letterhead. I slipped the folder into my bag. Deborah drove. Neither of us said much. She turned onto the road, leading to the church at 11:20, and parked near the back of the lot. Sunlight reflected off the steeple. Are you sure you want to do this? She asked. I've never been more certain. She squeezed my hand. Whatever happens in there, I'll be right outside. I nodded and opened the car door. Kessler was already there. I spotted him near the entrance, dressed in his gray suit and carrying his leather briefcase. He stood beside the flagpole with the patience of a man who billed by the hour, and had nowhere else he needed to be. When he saw me, He gave a single nod. I walked through the church's front doors. The service was already in progress. Hymns filled the sanctuary. The air was warm, carrying the familiar smell of old carpeting and coffee. I quietly slipped into the final pew and sat down. My father was seated in the front row. He turned when he heard the door open and saw me. His face immediately brightened, the proud father, the grateful deacon, the man of faith and sacrifice. He lifted his hand and waved. I waved back, a small wave, a patient wave. Meredith was sitting beside him. She glanced in my direction but didn't wave. The service ended at noon. The congregation moved into the fellowship hall, a wide room with a low ceiling, fluorescent lights, and rows of folding tables. Foil trays filled with baked ziti and green bean casserole covered the tables. Paper plates sat beside a tall stack of napkins. Near the front of the room stood a microphone connected to a small speaker that produced a quiet hum. Gerald was already standing beside it. He always was. He waited with his hands clasped in front of him, while all 120 people found places to sit. Chairs scraped across the linoleum floor. Children hurried between the tables. My father tapped the microphone. "Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to begin with something personal today." The room became quiet. As many of you know, my youngest daughter, Wendy, was involved in a serious car accident last month. She spent 3 weeks in a coma. The doctors weren't certain she would survive. He paused. He was good at pauses. But God is faithful. And today, Wendy is here with us. He turned and gestured toward me. I stood near the back wall. Every person in the room turned to look. Then they applauded. It was warm, sincere applause. A woman in the second row placed a hand over her heart. An elderly man nodded toward me. As a father, Gerald continued, allowing his voice to crack at precisely the right moment, there is nothing more terrifying than nearly losing your child. I prayed every single night. I never left her side. I felt those words land inside my chest, not like another wound, like a key turning inside a lock. I never left her side. He said it to 120 people who had no reason to question him. Family is everything, he continued. That is what I've always taught my girls. He looked directly at me and smiled. Then he opened his arms slightly. The universal gesture of a father waiting for his daughter to embrace him. I smiled in return. I began walking toward him. Everyone watched with gentle, expectant expressions. "Dad," I said loudly enough for the first 3 rows to hear. "May I say a few words?" He didn't hesitate. He couldn't, not while standing before 120 people who had just heard him call me his miracle. Miracle. "Of course, sweetheart." He handed me the microphone. His smile remained wide and confident. Then he stepped aside, placed his hands behind his back, and perfectly assumed the role of the supportive father. I wrapped my fingers around the microphone. It was still warm from his hand. I didn't look at him. I looked at the congregation. "Thank you all for your prayers. I'm sincerely grateful to be standing here. But I need to correct something my father just said." The room remained silent. Gerald's smile faded by 1 degree. My father didn't pray beside my hospital bed. He came to the hospital only once, on the night of the accident. He didn't come to check on me. He went to the billing department first. After that, he spoke to my surgeon. I could sense Gerald shifting beside me. I didn't turn toward him. He asked how much my surgery would cost. When he was given the amount, he said, and these are his exact words, documented in an official hospital incident report, "Let her go. We won't pay for the surgery. She's been a financial drain her whole life." Silence. Not a comfortable silence. It was the kind that pressed against your eardrums. Then he signed a "Do Not Resuscitate" order. Someone in the middle of the room inhaled sharply. A woman seated in the front row covered her mouth. I'm alive because a colleague, a nurse at the hospital, found my healthcare proxy and called my friend in the middle of the night. That friend drove 90 minutes through the rain to authorize my surgery. Not my father, not my sister, a friend. Gerald stepped forward. "Wendy, stop. You don't know what you're." "I'm not finished, Dad. This isn't the place. You chose this church as the place to lie. I'm choosing the same church as the place to tell the truth." "You're confused. The medication. I have the hospital records right here. No one in the room moved. Nobody reached for a glass of water. Nobody looked at a phone. 120 people were holding their breath. Gerald stopped speaking. Then the side door of the fellowship hall opened. Donald Kessler entered wearing his gray suit and carrying his leather briefcase. He was unhurried. He didn't scan the room for an empty chair. He walked straight to the front, placed his briefcase on the nearest folding table, and stood beside me with the quiet authority of a man who had handled situations like this 1,000 times. My father saw him, for the first time in my life, the first time I could ever remember. I watched Gerald Thomas become genuinely afraid, not angry, not insulted, afraid. "This is Mr. Donald Kessler," I said into the microphone. He was my grandmother, Lillian's attorney. A murmur moved through the room. Lillian's name still meant something in that church. She had attended it for 30 years. My grandmother left her house and her savings to me in a notarized will that was probated by the court 5 months ago. I paused and allowed the information to settle. My father knew nothing about it because my grandmother didn't trust him. Gerald opened his mouth, then he closed it. While I was in a coma, I continued. My father forged my signature on a power of attorney document. He transferred the house into his own name and took out a mortgage against it for $280,000. Someone gasped. Then, somewhere near the tables, at the back, a dish struck the floor. Someone's hand had gone slack. A fork clattered against the linoleum. Gerald's voice emerged louder now, filled with strain. "That's a lie. Eleanor left that house to the family, not only to you." Kessler opened his briefcase. He removed a single document, the original will, and held it where the people in the first rows could see its notary seal. "I have the original will here, Mr. Thomas," he said. His voice was level, almost gentle. "The property was left solely to Wendy Marie Thomas. Your name does not appear anywhere in this document." Gerald looked at Meredith. Meredith was staring at the floor. I lowered the microphone and addressed my father directly. I didn't whisper. I didn't shout. I simply spoke. "I'm not doing this to humiliate you, Dad. I'm doing it because you tried to let me die. And when that failed, you robbed me. I know this is a lot. If this story is affecting you deeply, you are not alone. Thousands of people have commented on stories like this one. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. Press that subscribe button so you don't miss how this ends, and tell me in the comments. What would you have said to Gerald in that moment, in front of everyone?" "Okay, let's continue." Gerald turned toward the congregation. His jaw was clenched, and his eyes moved around the room as he searched for an ally, a friendly face, anyone who might still support him. "She's taking heavy medication," he said. His voice remained controlled, but it was tight. "She doesn't understand what she's saying. This is a private family matter." No one answered. The room had become a wall of folded arms and unblinking eyes. Then a man's voice came from the back row. I didn't recognize him. "Then why is a lawyer standing here, Gerald?" My father didn't respond. His eyes shifted toward Pastor David, who stood near the coffee table with his hands tucked inside his pockets. "Gerald," the pastor said quietly, "I believe we should hear all of this." Gerald shifted again. He changed tactics the way he always did when authority stopped working. His posture softened. His shoulders dropped. He allowed his voice to break. "I've sacrificed everything for this family. Wendy's medical bills almost bankrupted us when she was a child. I did what I believed was best." I didn't lift the microphone. I spoke clearly from where I stood, the way a nurse speaks to a patient who is refusing to face the truth. "You did what was cheapest, Dad. There's a difference. You have no idea how much pressure I've been under. The debts, the—" He stopped. He realized what he had nearly admitted. His mouth closed like a door. Meredith rose from her chair. Her face had turned white. "Dad, stop talking." Gerald grabbed her arm. "Tell them, Meredith. Tell them I was trying to protect this family." She pulled her arm free. She looked at me. Then she looked at the floor and finally toward the exit. "I can't do this," she said. She began walking toward the door. As she passed me, close enough that no one else could hear, She whispered 6 words I will carry for the rest of my life. I should have called Deborah myself. Then she was gone. I watched the door close behind my sister. Everyone in the room was still watching me. I turned back toward the congregation. I'm not telling you this because I want to destroy my father. I'm telling you because he has stood behind this microphone for 15 years and told you who he is. I believe you deserve to know the truth. Then I turned toward Gerald. He was standing with his back almost pressed against the wall. His hands hung at his sides. The confident deacon who had opened the gathering was gone. In his place stood a man who looked smaller than I had ever seen him. Dad, this is what will happen. My voice was steady. I didn't need the microphone for this part. The room was quiet enough to hear someone turn a page. Yesterday, Mr. Kessler filed a motion with the county court to void the deed transfer because it was based on a forged power of attorney that I never signed. Gerald tightened his jaw. The bank that approved the mortgage has been informed that the title is disputed. The loan has been frozen. His left hand began trembling. I filed a police report on Friday for forgery and fraud. The notary who stamped your document is named in that report as well. He moved half a step backward. You will have to repay the entire $280,000, or you will face criminal charges. Gerald's response came out, raw, barely louder than a whisper. You would send your own father to prison. I looked directly at him without flinching. You signed a document allowing your own daughter to die. The fellowship hall seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere near the back, a child asked their mother a question and was quickly shushed. I'm not sending you anywhere, Dad. I'm giving you an opportunity to make this right. That's more than you gave me. Kessler shut his briefcase with a quiet click. The documents have already been filed with the court, Mr. Thomas. This is not a negotiation. Gerald looked around the room one final time. I watched the slow turn of his head as he studied each face. These were people he had known for years. Jim Callahan, whose pipes he had repaired every winter. Susan Merritt, who brought him coffee after each service. Robert Dill, the other deacon, who had stood beside him during every fundraiser for a decade. They all looked back at him. Not one of them looked away, and not one moved toward him. Gerald sat down, not on a chair, but on the edge of the nearest folding table. He covered his face with his hands. Robert walked over and placed one hand on Gerald's shoulder. It was firm, not comforting. Gerald, I think you should leave. Gerald stood. He walked toward the exit, his shoes making no sound against the linoleum floor. At the threshold, he turned and looked at me. His eyes were red. His mouth remained open, as though he wanted to speak. Perhaps he was searching for one final line that would affect the room the way his speeches always had. But nothing came. He left. I placed the microphone on the nearest table. My hands remained steady. My ribs hurt. I didn't care. I'm sorry for disrupting your Sunday, I told the congregation. My grandmother Lillian loved this church. She would have wanted the truth to be spoken here. 2 women approached and embraced me. A man I didn't know silently shook my hand. Pat had arrived before the service and had quietly stood near the coffee station. Throughout the entire confrontation, from across the room, she caught my eye and gave me one firm nod. Then someone touched my arm. It was a small, weathered hand. I turned and saw an elderly woman with white hair, a cardigan, and glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. My name is Doris Brennan, she said. Your grandmother and I sat together every Sunday for 20 years. I nodded. I didn't trust my voice. She talked about you every single week. She was incredibly proud of you, Wendy. She never stopped telling me about you. I had spent my entire life believing I was invisible in that place. I had assumed that no one in my father's world had ever truly seen me. Lillian had made certain that wasn't true. Within 24 hours, everything Gerald Thomas had built began to collapse. The bank froze the mortgage on Monday morning. Before noon, an attorney from the lender's fraud department contacted Kessler. The title was formally flagged as disputed. The loan was suspended. Gerald could no longer access the funds, refinance the property, or sell it. The $280,000 he had already spent was gone. The debt now belonged to him alone, secured against nothing. The county court accepted Kessler's motion to invalidate the deed transfer. Gerald received a summons at his house that same afternoon. A process server knocked on his door at 3:15. His neighbor was collecting the mail and witnessed the entire thing. The police launched a formal investigation into the forgery and fraud. Carl, the notary, was named in the report. By Tuesday, Carl had retained his own attorney and begun cooperating with investigators. Gerald was alone. News traveled through the church more quickly than any sermon ever had. On Tuesday evening, the board voted unanimously to ask Gerald to resign as deacon. Robert Dill called him personally. Gerald didn't argue. He didn't attend the meeting. His plumbing clients began leaving. 3 canceled on Monday, 5 more followed by Wednesday. Most were members of the church. One of them, Jim Callahan, sent Gerald a text containing a single sentence. "Don't come to my house again." Gerald called me at 10 that night. I answered. "You destroyed me," he said. His voice sounded flat and hollow. "No, Dad. You destroyed yourself. I simply stopped protecting you from the consequences." He ended the call. Then he called Meredith. She didn't answer. One more thing came to light that week. Kessler discovered it while conducting a routine review of my records. 3 years earlier, Gerald had changed the beneficiary on my life insurance policy from Deborah to himself. The form contained my signature. I had never signed it. My father had prepared for every possible version of my death. Not one of those plans involved saving me. Meredith called 3 days later. I was sitting on Deborah's couch with a heating pad across my ribs and a cup of tea growing cold on the table. My phone vibrated. Meredith's name appeared on the screen. I watched it for 2 complete rings before answering. "Wendy." Her voice was heavy. She had been crying. "I need to tell you something." "Then tell me." I knew about the DNR. I was sitting in the waiting room when Dad went to speak with the doctor. He told me what he planned to do. I didn't stop him. I said nothing. I allowed the silence to do what silence does. And I knew about the house, too. He promised me $85,000 if I stayed quiet, and you stayed quiet. Yes, while I was lying in a coma. Yes. Her voice broke. I was afraid of him, Wendy. I've always been afraid of him. I know that isn't an excuse. It isn't. She was crying hard now, the same way she had cried when we were children. Messy, loud, uncontrolled. I remembered that sound. It used to make me want to repair everything for her. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," she said. "I know I don't deserve that." "You're right, you don't. Not now." A long pause followed. I could hear her breathing, thin, uneven, and ragged. "But I'm not going to pretend you don't exist, Meredith. If you want to rebuild something with me, something that has nothing to do with Dad's money, you know where to find me." For a while, she didn't speak. Then she said quietly, "Grandma Lillian left me a letter, too." I sat upright. She wrote, "I love you, Meredith, but you are too much like your father. Choose differently." The line became silent. "Did you?" I asked. "Did you choose differently?" She didn't answer, because we both already knew. Forgiveness isn't something I owe anyone. But the door isn't locked. It is simply closed. She will have to knock. 1 month later, the deed to Lillian's house was restored to my name. The court voided the fraudulent transfer on a Wednesday. Kessler telephoned me at 10 that morning with the ruling. I thanked him. "Thank your grandmother," he replied. Then he paused. "She would have loved watching you in that fellowship hall." Gerald faced criminal charges: 3rd-degree forgery, fraud, and mortgage fraud. His attorney recommended accepting a plea agreement, probation, complete restitution, and no prison sentence if he cooperated. Gerald accepted. He had no other option. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and Carl had already told investigators everything. Gerald sold his house to repay the debt. The sale wasn't enough. The remaining balance would follow him for years. He moved in with his brother in Allentown. I heard that from Meredith, who had learned it from one of our cousins. I didn't attempt to verify it. I didn't need to. Meredith lost 2 real estate listings from members of the church. She didn't lose her license. She wasn't charged with a crime because she hadn't signed any of the documents. But people remembered. People always remember. I eventually returned to work, part-time at first. Pat rearranged the schedule so that I worked only day shifts during my first 2 months back. She didn't turn it into a big gesture. She simply handed me the new rotation and said, "Welcome back, Thomas." On a Saturday in late October, I drove to Norristown. I parked on Elm Street and walked toward the brick house with the creaking porch swing and the garden that had become slightly overgrown. I placed the key into the front door. My key, my door. Then I stepped inside. Lavender, that was the first thing I smelled. Lillian's lavender sachets remained tucked inside every closet and drawer. It was the scent of a woman who had prepared for everything. Her photograph sat on the mantel. It showed the two of us sitting on the porch swing, squinting into the sunlight. I couldn't remember who had taken it. I sat in her rocking chair. I didn't switch on the televisions. I didn't look at my phone. I simply sat there. For the first time in my life, I was sitting inside a house that belonged to me, not because I had finally earned anyone's approval, but because someone had loved me enough to ensure I would be all right. I once believed that being a good daughter meant absorbing everything my family threw at me. Every insult, every guilt trip, every time my father reminded me how much I had cost him. I accepted all of it and said, "Thank you," because I believed that was what love demanded. Silence, gratitude, obedience. I was wrong. Establishing a boundary isn't revenge. It is survival. And sometimes survival looks like a quiet man in a gray suit, a stack of notarized documents, and the courage to stand before 120 people and say, "This is what actually happened." I don't hate my father. Hating him would mean he still controlled my emotions. He doesn't. Not anymore. He is a man who made terrible decisions because of debts he was too proud to admit and an addiction he was too ashamed to confront. That doesn't excuse what he did. But it explains why I no longer need to carry his burden on my shoulders. If you're watching this and recognize yourself anywhere in my story, in the guilt, the silence, or the bone-deep belief that you owe the people who have harmed you, I want you to hear this clearly. You don't. You don't owe anyone your health. You don't owe anyone your home. And you certainly don't owe anyone your life. My grandmother Lillian taught me that. Not through lectures. Not through shouting. She taught me with a letter, a house, and a lawyer named Kessler. I still attend church, by the way. It's a different church. The same God, a smaller congregation, friendlier coffee. And I sit in the front row, not because I need people to see me, because I'm finished hiding in the back. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. If Wendy's story resonated with you or reminded you of someone you love, leave a comment below. Tell me, what boundary have you established that changed your life? I would love to hear your story. And if you want more stories like this one, check the description. Another story is waiting there that I believe you'll connect with even more, Stubor. And I'll see you in the next one.